Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. A million years ago now, when I was a bright-eyed young lawyer working in a big end-of-town Sydney legal firm, I heard whispers of a certain book everyone was reading, a satirical look at life in a big city law firm and one lawyer's quest to dig himself out of the moral hole he'd fallen into whilst working there. The book was called Has Harbour Views, and it was written by Richard Beasley, a Sydney barrister, who has gone on to write another 4 novels since then. And Richard's latest novel, The Burden of Lies, was published in 2017 by Simon & Schuster. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Richard to the podcast today. Hello, Richard.
Hi, Claudine. Thanks for having me.
Now, Has Harbour Views was the first of your novels I read. It was a book that, at the time of its release and since, seems to resonate with many lawyers on many different levels. But I think most would agree it takes the mickey out of corporate lawyers. It's a tongue-in-cheek look at life in a big law firm. Was it always your intention to write this kind of book?
No. When I started writing it, which literally was a lifetime ago, because I wasn't even a barrister when I started it, I was a solicitor, I was going to write a legal thriller. But as I started writing the book, I couldn't stop myself from making jokes about the legal profession, which didn't create the best tone for a legal thriller. So I realised I had to change what the book was about and make it more of a, as you say, a journey of the main character from losing his soul to try and getting it back. I think the book probably still resonates now. I know that because I continue to get correspondence from young lawyers around Australia working at big law firms saying, with your book, you've written my life. In fact, I've got a folder full of correspondence like that started from when the book first came out and continues to grow even now, given the book just had a reprint in January with my new publisher. For some young lawyers working in big law firms, it's a familiar story of being overworked, badly treated, doing work that's possibly or arguably morally dubious, and then considering, is this really what I became a lawyer for, and is this what I want to do for the rest of my life?
What inspired you to write it?
Well, I wanted to be a writer. That's the first thing, so that's a good start for writing a novel. And look, first book, the advice you're given is write about what you know.
Yeah.
And one thing I did know about was working as a solicitor in large law firms, and from my own personal experience, and there is an extent to which this book is a Romana clef, I suppose. I did work as a solicitor that caused me to pause from time to time about whether this was the best thing for my life to be doing this sort of work, acting for banks and whatnot. You continue to have that as a barrister, of course, although we have the fallback of saying, well, there's a cab rank rule and we're all terribly independent and we take briefs from anywhere without fear or favour or without bias. But as a solicitor, I had qualms about what I was doing from time to time, and I channeled that into the main character who's having similar qualms.
Were you surprised by the book's reception?
I think before the book was published, but after I had a contract and when it was about to be published, I was incredibly nervous because someone described it to me as, I was at the bar by the time it was coming out to be published. Someone described it as the longest suicide note ever written by a barrister in history, because you won't be getting any work after this, which turned out to not be entirely true, but that did make me nervous. And some people were suggesting that some of the characters in the book that are not particularly flattering portraits of human beings may be recognisable as some real people, which I said was, of course, not true. There's no resemblance to anyone alive at the moment. First print run sold out in no time. So I knew it was a book that had gotten a lot of interest, and film rights were snapped up really quickly too. So it did well, and that no one ever put up their hand and said that adulterous, corrupt, horrible, timesheet cheating, fraudulent solicitor in that law firm is clearly me. So I avoided defamation suits as well. So it all turned out all right. But and you're also, look, I think any novel you have coming out, an author, whoever he or she is going to be nervous about how it's reviewed, if it's reviewed, how it sells, whether it's going to be considered a good book, a bad book, etc. So there's always nerves, and I had particular nerves because there was double, because first of all it's your first novel, you're putting yourself out there as a novelist, and you're going to be judged on the quality of your book. But I was also writing about the profession that I was actually engaged in my day job, so it was a double nervousness, if you like.
So as you mentioned, only 4 years after the publication of this debut novel came the film adaptation of the book, starring Matt Day and Lisa McCune, along with a host of other familiar Aussie faces. And how did that feel for you? Were you happy with the result?
I was. I think, it was an ABC production, so the budget was limited. At one stage, it looked like it was going to have to be called Hell with District Views, but they managed to find some space in a city skyscraper to film it in. I think they did a terrific job. The guy that wrote the script and directed it, Peter Duncan, was for a lawyer at a big law firm for about 5 minutes before he ran off to film school. And I thought he did a fantastic job, and Peter went on with the producers of Has Harbour Views, Ian Colley. They went on to make Rake. But it was for Ian, it was his first time doing drama as distinct from docos. But I thought they were great. I thought the cast was great, and I thought it was a really good adaptation. Unfortunately, the ABC decided they'd put it, I think they didn't even know until we told them, but they decided to air it first on a Sunday night, which happened to be the first time the Australian Open men's tennis final had gone to a night sitting, and Leighton Hewitt made the final. And we were encouraging them to put it on the following week, but the ABC assured us that they couldn't be seen to be responding to commercial television's timing, all of which, in my view, would have been proper grounds for dismissing the board of the ABC and the managing director at the time. But that didn't happen. So that was slightly disappointing, and they did have to air it again. One of my friends actually rang me up after it had gone to air, and I answered the phone, and he said, "Oh, g'day." And I said, "What did you think?" And he said, "The third set was great." It was good. It was fun. It was filmed near my chamber, so I was able to go up there and watch them film it from time to time. I even have a very small role without a line, so as someone walking down a corridor, which I played brilliantly, I'm told.
So I've just finished reading your latest book, The Burden of Lies. This is the second book in your Peter Tanner series, and apart from the fact that a lawyer is once more the central character, it's very different from your first novel. I would say a legal thriller to rival a John Grisham novel, exploring the underbelly of Sydney's property development scene and the ethical and moral dilemmas faced by criminal defence lawyers. That's
a perfectly good summary. It is, and with the exception that it doesn't have the John Grisham sales, disappointingly. And I would compare it more closely, I think, to the people that I've enjoyed, and I think were more of an inspiration to me writing this Peter Tanner series than Grisham, who I still think has written some really terrific books. It is Michael Connolly, who did the Lincoln Lawyer series, or still doing the Mickey Haler Lincoln Lawyer series, and probably a guy called Scott Turow, who wrote what some people consider to be the rebirth of the legal thriller Presumed Innocent back in the late 80s, which was made into a film with Harrison Ford. Yeah. In terms of a comparison between Cyanide Games and The Burden of Lies and Has Harbour Views, the tone is obviously different. Has Harbour Views is mainly, it's got serious parts to the book, but it's playing for laughs. These books are legal thrillers. I think Tanner's got a pretty well-developed sense of humour, but it's more a biting sense of humour. And the plot, it doesn't involve funny things. It involves serious corruption, serious violence and serious crime. And as you say, the ethical challenges that Tanner faces as a criminal defence lawyer.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to ask you, how did the idea or inspiration for this book come about, this particular one?
It's pretty much what I said. You asked me what did I have in mind when I wrote Has Harbour Views. I finally got around to writing the book the books that I was thinking I was going to write before I wrote Has Harbour Views. This time I'd gotten all of the jokes out of my system with Hell and was able to actually write something that is in that sort of legal thriller, crime thriller genre. So it had been a long-term plan. It's just that I did other books first.
For listeners who haven't read it yet, can you tell me a little bit more about it?
Well, The Burden of Lies is the protagonist in the book is a criminal barrister called Peter Tanner, who's an exceptionally good criminal barrister, but whilst he's by no means a crook himself, he is someone who more than bends the rules from time to time in the cases he's working on to get what he considers an achievement of justice. In this particular book, he's acting for a woman that's been accused of having someone killed that she had a form of vendetta about. And it involves property developers in Sydney and whether they're corrupt or not, bankers in Sydney and whether they've more than bent the rules or not, and the plot involving the accused, whose name is Tina Leonard, is wrapped up in the ins and outs of property development and banking in Sydney.
You don't actually practice criminal law.
I do not.
Yet Tanner has to prepare his defence, and he has to go to the defence of Tina Leonard, and he has to go to trial. So I'm wondering, how much research did you have to do for this book?
The feedback I get from both of these books is that the parts of the books that people have most enjoyed have been the court scenes. Even non-lawyers enjoy the court scenes, but even lawyers, the feedback I've got from lawyers that have read the books is they sort of say at last it was entertaining, but it was also authentic to us and not something that a lawyer reads and goes, we know that doesn't happen. So this is rubbish. But and they're the most enjoyable parts of the book to write. But in terms of courtcraft, I do practice in a barrister, so I'm obviously familiar with court generally. As you say, I'm not a criminal lawyer and I've never run a jury trial, which is obviously what Tanner does all the time. So there is elements of research I had to do. I think my aim was to be, again, you're not writing a criminal textbook, so not everything has to be 100% as how things would necessarily play out in a real criminal trial, but I was very conscious of making sure it was sufficiently authentic that no one that was, for example, another criminal lawyer reading the book would go, hang on, nah, this can't happen. So there was research for that, and I think members of the public or your readers if they're going to read a book like this, they have a certain working knowledge of how court systems work, which you also can't offend. But equally, you're writing a book that's a form of entertainment, and Peter Tanner probably is braver with the way he treats his opponents and even his own clients and witnesses and even judges.
And the judge, yes.
Braver than most barristers would be. But that's him.
Yeah.
That's part of his personality. He's got a fearlessness.
You touch on a really interesting point there, because my my impression of him as I closed the book was, he's a bit of a cowboy, because it's rare that you would see anybody behave in that way in a courtroom.
Look, cowboy in the sense that he does push the rules and or even break them from time to time, but he is still a technically really competent lawyer.
Yep, and he knows it, because he makes that point a number of times.
It was important to me in creating the character that to have him as a legitimately good lawyer. It doesn't really work if you're not convinced that the lawyer protagonist, assuming there is one, is also a really good lawyer, regardless of what else they do. I think that's, well, to me anyway, that was pretty fundamental. And if you look at, as I said, the books that have inspired me, like Michael Connolly's Mickey Haler series, whatever else you think about Mickey Haler, he's a very, very, whilst he's quirky in many ways, and his office is in the back of a Lincoln Continental, he's a very good criminal defence attorney. And the attorneys in Scott Turo's books, like Presumed Innocence, and other books he's written, are good lawyers too. And I think it just wouldn't work unless Peter was a good lawyer.
Indeed. Now, as a local, I was fascinated by the commentary on Sydney's planning environment, the redevelopment of the harbour foreshore, the surge of high-density housing in the suburbs, and the proliferation of residential towers right across Sydney. It's a book that can't fail to have readers thinking about the machinations, legal and not so legal, behind significant property developments in big cities. Was there a particular event that perhaps sparked the idea for this book?
You only have to drive around some Sydney suburbs, or I'll give you an example, driving up Anzac Parade in sort of Kingsford, Maroubra sort of area, and you look around and you think, how on earth did any decision-making body approve that development? We've obviously seen developments like the new Crown Casino that Sydney's getting that were approved lawfully, but in a fashion not as orthodox, perhaps, as other large-scale developments have to go through. There's, and Barangaroo itself, I think all the development there was a case where clearly contamination matters weren't being handled according to the law. So while the case was being run and going to be lost, the law was changed. I've worked on cases myself where a coal mine has been, or a mining lease has been declared invalid by the Court of Appeal, only for that decision to be legislated out of existence the following day by Parliament. So all of those things feed into my mind, and then you start using your imagination to create something fictitious but inspired by those sorts of things.
Now, I don't want to give away any spoilers, but I did want to touch on something Pete Tanner himself grapples with throughout this book, and that is the presumption of innocence as a fundamental principle of criminal law, and the fact that everyone is entitled to this presumption and the right to a fair trial and a fair hearing. And I think it's fair to say that Tanner cops his share of flack about his work as a criminal defence barrister, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does, even from his son, who doesn't understand how his father could possibly represent people that are clearly criminals. And Tanner has to have discussions with him as well as his own conscience about the fact that he's providing a defence and his skills and services to people that, whilst they may not have ever said to him, I did it, because if they do that, then he can't go to court and say they didn't. But throughout his career, he's no doubt, well, he has acted for people that he probably more than suspects are actually guilty of what they're charged with, but nevertheless provides a vigorous and competent defence and on many occasions secures them an acquittal. What you have to balance with that is that the system would break down if on a hunch or a whim or even on based on an analysis of the evidence, barristers just took the view that, well, I'm not going to appear for that person because I think they're guilty. Otherwise, people will end up not being represented. And then the system completely collapses. But that's quite a sophisticated notion to describe to in this case, with Tanner's 14-year-old son, who just sees it as teenagers tend to do in more black and white terms. And Tanner has to have those conversations. He has those conversations with himself that, the ethics of what he's doing, even within the rules of the profession, are quite a challenge. Of course, with the novel The Burden of Lies, he's got, and this doesn't give away the ending at all, he's got the even greater dilemma of being worried about that he might actually be defending someone that's innocent, which is even more pressure.
I love Pete Tanner's self-effacing nature, his dry wit. He's jaded, but in this book we still see glimpses of hope, I think. His desire to believe that people can be good and to take them at their word. And despite his gruff talk, I think he really does have a conscience. He's obviously deeply affected by the loss of his wife, what happened to him as a kid, and the kind of work that he does. Do you know somebody like him?
I do know principled and committed solicitors and barristers that are committed and principled in the way he is and have regard to their conscience as well as the obligations they might have to their client, and also have regard to the obligations they have to the court and the judicial system, not just to their own pockets or their own clients' interests.
What made you actually want to become a writer?
I think it goes back to falling in love with books when you're at school. That I wasn't much interested in books until I was about 15, and Year 10 had a great English teacher who was extremely encouraging in terms of broadening what I was reading and directing important books to me, important in the sense of important to read them when you're young and impressionable or more impressionable. So I think reading books like Catcher in the Rye, which is a fundamental book for teenage boys in particular, or anyone that wants to understand the teenage male mind or the adolescent male mind, and also The Great Gatsby. Reading those books just made me a big reader, and all writers are big readers, I think. It's where you get most of your inspiration from, is from other people's work. And, being an enthusiastic reader just leads to, if you've got any talent in terms of written expression, then it just leads to a desire to I think, do it yourself.
I was interested to know when you find the time to write.
So Hell was written in the early hours of the morning to begin with when I was still a solicitor. Then it was written anytime I liked during the day when I was a solicitor. And Burden of Lies, for example, I wrote pretty much in a period of December, January, February, with great intensity, like 4,000 words a day, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Are you working on anything at the moment?
Yeah, I've got another contract for another Tanner book, which was due at the publishers on the 1st of February. I spent all last year in Adelaide on a royal commission, which meant that the 1st of February deadline has passed, but that has been extended to the 1st of May in order for the book to come out on the 1st of December. It's called When the Truth Runs Dry. Okay. But there's not much else I can tell you other than...
If listeners want to find out a little bit more about you and your books, where can they find you?
I've got a website, which is richardbeasley.com.au, and when it is appropriate, I'm very active on Twitter under my name. Peter Tanner, believe it or not, is very active on Twitter. Based on reading his tweets, he's probably more adventurous as a tweeter than I would be as a member of the bar. But good on him, I say. And I certainly follow him. And, I mean, I'm on Instagram, so if people want to look at my photos there, they can go ahead.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, listeners, you heard it here first. Peter Tanner is on Twitter, so get onto it. Richard's books are available now from all good bookstores or selected e-retailers. Thank you so much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today, Richard.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it, Claudine.
Thank you. I did too. And for a chance to get your hands on a signed copy of Richard's latest book, head over to my Instagram account and follow the directions to enter the draw to win. Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage, claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.